What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is January 7th, 2025, about 10 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 15 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, written by the mysterious Professor Thomas Hardy Leahey. In our last reading, we finished chapter 6, where we talked about the Enlightenment. And now we are moving on from the Enlightenment, which was a very dense chapter, on to chapter 7, The Ascent of Science, which is from pages 191 to page 217. Today we will be dividing chapter 7 into two parts by reading the first 13 pages. So we will be reading from 191 to page 204, and hopefully tomorrow we will be finishing all of chapter 7 as well. Hopefully you've been finding these enlightening, entertaining, engaging, informative, etc. as we delve through the history of psychology and Western thought in general. If you have any comments, put it in the chat. We will get to it. And without further ado, let's go. Chapter 7, The Ascent of Science, from 1815 to 1914. Introduction. The 19th century was the century in which psychology came of age as a recognized discipline. It was also a period of rapid social change. The Industrial Revolution transformed the face of Europe. Working in urban factories and great department stores replaced working on farms and village stores. European gross domestic product grew 170% in the course of the century. The population of Europe more than doubled, from 205 million people in 1800 to 414 million in 1900. Government grew even faster. In Great Britain, for example, the number of bureaucrats rose from 99,000 in 1800 to 395,000 in 1900. That's a lot. I feel like that's a lot even for today. But I guess it depends on what you qualify as a bureaucrat. Anyway, the state began to take over the roles of ancient private corporations such as guilds, religious orders, and charities in guiding people's lives. As the rapid growth of cities overwhelmed the idea of the night watchman state, of strictly limited powers, such as the power to conduct war. As governments grew, they also became more democratic, as suffrage was gradually extended from property holders to all male citizens. It would not be until well in the 20th century that women would be able to vote in all Western countries. Because they were rapid, these changes were keenly felt. Nearly overwhelmed by the modern society exploding around them, social and political leaders turned to social science for the tools they needed to regain control of history. By the end of the century, psychology, the modern science for the modern age, would become a key player in shaping the modern world. The rise of science as a new worldview that challenged religion was central to the history of the 19th century. The writer G.H. Lewes wrote, "Science is penetrating everywhere and slowly changing man's conception of the world and of man's destiny." Prior to the 19th century, science had been respected and emulated, but it had not yet accomplished very much, nor had it become well known outside the salons of the philosophers. The way most people lived their lives had changed little since the invention of agriculture millennia earlier. The vast majority of people lived and worked on farms and traveled no farther than a day or two's walk from their place of birth. Chemical dyes having not yet been invented, only aristocrats wore anything but drab clothing. People knew little of the outside world, and education past simple reading and arithmetic was rare. Most people were completely illiterate. Social or technological change was slow, even glacial. In the 19th century, science increased the pace of change, deeply altering the human way of life. Industrialization revealed the power of science to dramatically control and alter the world. Electricity began to carry information on telegraph wires and to illuminate the night. Chemistry created dyes, changing profoundly how people dressed and thus how they appeared to others and in their own reflection. People began to work in factories and to move to cities. Railroads carried people great distances and brought new things to their doors. Stores opened and shopping was invented. People learned to read and they devoured books on popular science, supporting the careers of people such as T.H. Huxley and Herbert Spencer. Let's go to figure 7.1. This is Hermann von Helmholtz, the most important physical scientist of the 19th century, whose ideas influenced two of the founders of psychology, Wundt and Freud. Wundt studied with Helmholtz as a postdoc, and critical ideas of his first system of psychology were drawn from Helmholtz. Freud was taught by one of Helmholtz's students, and his first systematic work, Project for a Scientific Psychology, was written in the spirit of Helmholtz's psychological reductionism. His later psychoanalysis drew heavily on Helmholtz's formulation of the important law of conservation of energy, which led Freud to see the mind as a battleground of mental energies. Interesting. Unsurprisingly, as science became better known and demonstrated its world-shaking powers, it came to challenge religion. Some thinkers of the 19th century were so excited by science and the possibilities that it became, for them, a sort of religion, with its own demands and claims of authority. The mathematician W.A. Clifford, born 1845 and died in 1879, wrote that people have a universal duty of questioning all that we believe, and that it is wrong always and everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Faith was no longer acceptable as a road to truth. The infallibility of the Pope was challenged by the claim that science is infallible. At the extreme, the positivist Auguste Comte wanted a scientific religion of humanity to replace the worship of God, but only his most devoted followers went that far. Such people, of course, did not lose their religion. They simply changed churches. Others were touched by science more deeply. They lost their old religious faith, but were unsure how to replace it or if it should be replaced. For many, Romanticism seemed to offer an inspiring faith based on emotion, hinting at an intuition, or at least a hope, of something beyond the material world. Other people participated in new quasi-religious movements, such as spiritualism, because they seemed to offer evidence that humans had souls and that there was an afterlife. And there were those who lived on nerve. As one Victorian agnostic put it, I no longer believe in anything, but I mean to live and die like a gentleman. Having lost their religion, they simply chose, by sheer force of will, to act as if Christianity were true. Psychology, psyche logos, or the study of the soul, could not help but be affected by the Victorian crisis of conscience. Some people looked to psychology to continue to teach them about the soul. The tradition was especially powerful in America, where the religiously oriented Scottish psychology continued with little change until after the Civil War. On the other hand, psychology began to offer ways of beliefs. As science became popular, scientific and pseudoscientific psychology became popular too. People read about phrenology, joined phrenological clubs, and sought the advice of phrenologists on whom to marry and what career to pursue. Scientific psychologists would eventually perform many of the functions served by priests and ministers, advancing the cause of applied psychology. On the other hand, some people turned to psychology, specifically physical research, for proof that the soul existed. In some, psychology helped deepen the Victorian crisis of conscience and began to move into areas previously dominated by religious ideas, but it was shaped by religious yearnings even as it undermined religious beliefs. Moving on to movements, the reassertion of emotion and intuition, the Romantic Revolt. Although we usually think of Romanticism as a movement in the arts, it was much more. It carried on the protest of the counter-enlightenment against the Cartesian Newtonian worldview. As romantic poet and artist William Blake, who lived from 1757 and died in 1827, William Blake prayed, "May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." The Romantics regarded Cartesian claims for the supremacy of reason as overweening and combated them with paeans to strong feeling and non-rational intuition. Whereas some Enlightenment writers, notably Hume, had valued mild and moral passions, the Romantics were inclined to worship all strong emotions, even violent and destructive ones. Above all, the Romantics fervently believed there was more in the universe than atoms and the void, and by unleashing passion and intuition, one might reach a world beyond the material. To this end, many Romantics took psychoactive drugs, hoping to escape the bonds of ordinary rational consciousness in search of higher, almost Platonic truth. I didn't know that. I didn't know that they were taking, were they dropping acid in the 18th century and the 19th century? Were they smoking Bubba Cushy? Okay. Unsurprisingly, the Romantics' conception of the mind differed from that of the Enlightenment's Newtons of the mind. Most Enlightenment writers concerned themselves with conscious experience. The Romantics adumbrated ideas of the unconscious, the primal and chaotic home of feeling and intuition. I'd never heard this word adumbrated. I'm going to look that up and drop it in the adumbrate definition. What is this? Adumbrates. So, okay. Represent in an outline. Okay, there's two definitions of this. Let's see. All right, adumbrate. Drop it here. Let's see if it got in here. No. Adumbrate. Okay, hold on. All right, I got too much in here. Hold on. All right. First part. Adumbrate. Okay, first one, represent in an outline. Hobhouse had already adumbrated the idea of the welfare state, or illustrated. Okay, I get that. Okay, or foreshadow. Or overshadow. Okay, this word has three different meanings. Interesting. It means to foreshadow a future event. For example, tenors solemnly adumbrate the fate of the convicted sinner. Interesting. Okay. And then overshadow. Interesting. Her happy reminiscences were adumbrated by consciousness of something else. Okay, interesting. I haven't seen a word with three very different meanings. That's a very interesting word. Still obscure, though. Where were we? So, unsurprisingly, the Romantics' conception of the mind differed from that of the Enlightenment's Newtons of the mind. Most Enlightenment writers concern themselves with conscious experience. The Romantics adumbrated ideas of the unconscious, the primal and chaotic home of feeling and intuition. Basically, they highlighted or illustrated or elevated the ideas of the unconscious. So the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who lived from 1788 and died in 1860, posited will, capital will with a capital W, as the noumenal reality behind appearances. Schopenhauer's will, specifically the will to live, pushes humanity onto endless futile striving for something better. This description of the will foreshadows Freud's id. Schopenhauer wrote in Pararga, "In the heart of every band there lives a wild beast. Intelligence tries to control the will, but its raging inflicts pain on the self and others." Also prefiguring Freud were those writers who saw in dreams the language of the unconscious needing only to be decoded to reveal the secrets of the infinite. In contrast to the rather bloodless and mechanical picture of the mind advanced by many philosophers, especially in Britain, the Romantics depicted the mind as free and spontaneously active. The will is a wild beast, but while that wildness implies pain, it also implies freedom of choice. Schopenhauer's philosophy thus was voluntaristic, a romantic reaction against the Enlightenment's materialistic determinism. Generally, this led the Romantics to worship heroes, geniuses, and artists, those who asserted their wills and did not bow to the way of the world. Thomas Carlyle, for instance, revered heroes who ranged from Odin to Shakespeare to Napoleon. The romantic emphasis on the mind's independent activity can be found even in the study of perception. Most philosophers followed Hume in seeing perception as a process of making impressions on a passive mind. Influenced by Kant, Leibniz, and the European idealist tradition, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was born in 1772 and died in 1834, for instance, likened the mind to a lamp. Instead of merely registering impressions, the mind cast intellectual light, actively reaching out to the world and shaping the resulting experience. I wonder if that guy, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, was the first one to think of an idea as a light bulb floating above the head. That would be, he should have patented that or copyrighted that, whatever, trademarked that. Anyway, sorry. Romantics rejected the mechanical conception of society that had led to the French Enlightenment, whose beginning they lauded, but whose bloody ending they lamented. If society, like physical nature, is just a machine, then, like nature, it may be rationally and scientifically controlled. Against this view, romantics such as Edmund Burke, who lived from 1729 and died in 1797, held that societies were grown, not made. The customs of civil society grew slowly into a rich, interconnected set of customs, norms, and beliefs, often only marginally present to consciousness. Thinking some social practice is traditional was akin to thinking the shape of a tree is irrational. Moreover, just as too much pruning and shaping can kill a tree, so scientific planning can kill a culture. As a member of Parliament, a lonely Burke applauded the American Revolution because it asserted the time-honored rights of English people against a tyrannical king. Later, however, Burke denounced the French Revolution for overturning the natural, evolved French way of life in the name of abstract reason. As a philosophy, the Romantic movement was short-lived, but its legacy was a great split in psychology. Although not necessarily elevating passion and intuition, the founding psychologists all viewed the mind in the spirit of Romanticism. Wundt called his psychology voluntaristic, stressing the independence of mental principles of development from physical ones. James, too, was a voluntarist, deeply committed to the reality and freedom of will. Freud, of course, picked up the notion of the unconscious and elevated its passions over the still small voice of reason as the causes of human thoughts and behavior. Nevertheless, in the English-speaking world with which we are primarily concerned, the conception of mind and later behavior as essentially mechanistic and driven from outside soon replaced the romantic one, despite William James's later protestations. Likewise, in the 20th century, psychologists would be deeply involved in the kinds of scientific social engineering that horrified the conservative heirs to Burke. At least in psychology, Romanticism was defeated by the continuing Enlightenment. The continuing Enlightenment, developments in utilitarianism and associationism. Not everyone was disenchanted by the Newtonian spirit. Many important thinkers carried on the Enlightenment project, especially in England and France. Indeed, out of the continuing Enlightenment came the central concepts of 20th century American psychology. The fusing of the principle of utility with associationism began with James Mill, who lived from 1773 to 1836. James Mill was a politician turned philosopher. His associationism, a simple Lego theory of mind, was the frequent target of later, more holistic psychologists such as Wundt, James, and the Gestalt psychologists. In Mill's view, the mind is a passive blank slate that is receptive to simple sensations, the Lego blocks, out of which complex sensations or ideas are compounded by forming associative links, clicking the blocks together between atomic units. As had Condillac, Mill dispensed with the mental faculties retained by Hume, Hartley, and other previous associationists. Combined with utilitarian hedonism, the result was a completely mechanical picture of mind, in which idea follows idea automatically, with no room left for voluntary control. The exercise of will is an illusion, Mill maintained. Reasoning is no more than idea following idea, governed by the laws of association. Attention is simply the fact that the mind is necessarily preoccupied by current ideas that are pleasurable or painful. Like Bentham and many others who wrote on the mind, Mill expounded his psychology for purposes of political reform. Influenced by Helvetius, as was Bentham, Mill was especially interested in education. If humans are blank slates at birth, education may be used to mold the mind. Mill put his ideas into practice by the rigorous education he gave his son, teaching him ancient Greek at age 3 and Latin at age 8. This son wrote a history of Roman law when he was 10 years old. The son, John Stuart Mill, born 1806 and died 1873, did not become the perfect utilitarian his father had expected. However, although an early adherent of Benthamism, he experienced a nervous breakdown during which he came to find Benthamism sterile, narrow, excessively calculating, and even evil. He eventually tempered Bentham's hedonistic principles with Wordsworth's romantic vision of nature and human feeling. He endorsed the romantic preference for the grown or natural over the manufactured, and he denied that human beings are machines. He saw people as living things whose autonomous development and growth should be nurtured, a vision most fully expressed in his On Liberty, the founding document of political libertarian thought. J.S. Mill was an important spokesman for the idea that the social sciences were legitimate sciences, though he recognized that they might never achieve the degree of perfection attained by the natural sciences. Despite this, he believed that social sciences were not in principle different from the natural sciences and should use the same methods. He wrote an important work on scientific method, beginning the development of the sophisticated experimental and analytic techniques psychologists use today. The influence of Mill and Comte was so great that German ideas about the methodological and theoretical differences between the natural and human sciences were rarely discussed in the English-speaking world. In philosophical psychology, Mill modified his father's mechanical associationism by creating an analogy between chemistry and psychology. Earlier associationists, including his father, had recognized that certain associative links became so strong that the linked ideas appear inseparable. J.S. Mill went further, maintaining that elementary ideas could fuse into a whole idea with properties possessed by none of its atomic elements. In chemistry, for example, we learn that water is a wet liquid composed of two gases, hydrogen and oxygen. Similarly, complex mental ideas may be composed of sensory elements, yet have unique characteristics of their own. An example is what early psychologists call color fusion. Spin a disc divided into wedges, each colored with a primary color, and at a certain speed the experience will be of whiteness, not of spinning colors. The atomic colors on the wheel generate a new color, white, not present on the disc. Mill was influenced by the romantic conception of coalescence, the idea that active imaginations may synthesize atomic elements into a creation that is more than the sum of the atomic units themselves, as when elementary colors are mixed to make a qualitatively different one. Although Mill tempered his father's associationistic Benthamism with the broader conceptions of Romanticism, he sought to improve utilitarianism and empiricism, not to refute them. He always detested the mystic intuitionism of Coleridge, Carlyle, and the other Romantics. Nor did Mill accept romantic voluntarism. His mental chemistry, although it recognized the possible coalescence of sensations and ideas, remained an atomistic conception of mind, suggesting that scientific psychology resembled analytic chemistry, discovering the basic elements out of which mental objects are associatively compounded. Moreover, in Mill's view, it is not the mind's enormous activity that brings down the qualitative chemical change, but the way the sensations are associated in experience. One does not choose to see the white spinning disk. The experience is forced as one's perception by the conditions of the experiment. Very interesting. I mean, that is, we're sort of see the world. We see the world and interact with the world based on our, relation to the world, right? And also how the world looks at us, right? But he's saying, there's, these things that we associate with each other, they sort of bleed into each other, right? And so maybe a part of our construction of ourself or the worlds around us comes from, what we've been told about ourselves and the world around us. Anyway, a philosophy of and for science, positivism. As we saw in Chapter 6, the Enlightenment philosophers venerated Newtonian science and began to apply the Newton science. So, as we saw in Chapter 6, the Enlightenment philosophers venerated Newtonian science and began to apply the Newtonian spirit to the study of human nature and human affairs. These tendencies deepened in the 19th century and were given clear and forceful expression in the positive philosophy of Auguste Comte, who was born in 1798 and died in 1857. Like the philosophers, Comte was not a philosopher, scientist, or academic, but a public writer and lecturer who wanted to bring about political and social change rather than advance the cause of science. Unlike the philosophers who talked about themselves in their glittering aristocratic salons and who cultivated enlightened despots, Comte addressed the working classes and the women excluded from politics by the restored French aristocracy. Interesting. Okay, so it sounds like Comte is going to be a freedom fighter. Let me find out. He said some racist shit. Let me find out. I'm sure it's not that hard to find. Let's go here. There's a lot to read here. There's a lot to read. You know what? We might catch up on this the next time. I might have let you down if you were hoping to see the entire chapter. But we'll probably wrap it up, this entire chapter, for tomorrow's read. I'm hella tired. I've been working hella hard, so I don't want to give you a bad reading by not reading with full energy. So we're going to come back early tomorrow, knock out another stream. Hopefully you enjoyed this. We'll pick up on this next part right here. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.